Some nurses forget their place. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 6 hours before Megan O'Brien would crack open a 4-star general's chest with her bare hands. Morning rounds at Seattle General move like clockwork. Dr. Whitfield leads them, a man whose confidence fills rooms the way cologne fills elevators, thick and impossible to ignore. He's discussing patient protocols in Trauma Bay 3 when he notices Megan standing near the monitor stand, her pale blue scrub somehow making her smaller than she is. She's adjusting the 4-drip, the way she's done 10,000 times in 3 years, and something about her presence irritates him. Maybe it's her silence. Maybe it's the way her hands move with absolute certainty while the residents around him still hesitate. Some nurses, he says, loud enough for the entire bay to hear, seem to forget they're not physicians. They develop ideas above their station. Inappropriate emotional attachments. Boundary issues. He doesn't look at Megan directly, but the message lands exactly where he intends it. The residents glance at her. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't look up from the 4. Her jaw tightens, just a fraction, a tremor no one else would catch, and then it releases. She continues her work as if he hasn't spoken. This is Megan O'Brien at Seattle General in San Antonio, Texas. Night shift registered nurse, 3 years of stellar performance reviews, 0 complaints, 0 incidents. The kind of nurse who arrives early and leaves late. The kind who remembers patient names and asks about their grandchildren. The kind who makes other nurses look like they're moving in slow motion. Nobody knows that under her mattress at home sits a locked box containing a pair of child-sized combat boots, leather-worn soft as fabric, still carrying dust from Baghdad. Nobody knows that the slight limp in her left leg isn't from a car accident but from shrapnel she took at age 28 while shielding a boy from a mortar strike. Nobody knows that when she counts a patient's pulse, she's counting in a rhythm learned during 17 years with the Naval Special Warfare Command. Master Chief Petty Officer. The rank sits in her blood like marrow. She moves through Seattle General's corridors like a ghost wearing scrubs. Invisible. Safe. Unknown. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song as she pushes a medication cart down the 3rd-floor hallway at 19:05 hours. The cart wheels squeak, a sound that's become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She's checking the evening medications, cross-referencing charts with the precision of someone who understands that mistakes kill people. 1 milligram, not 2. The difference between healing and disaster. In the break room, 2 residents are laughing about something. Megan hears her name. She pauses outside the doorway, not eavesdropping exactly, but not avoiding it either. One of them, a young man named Pierce with the kind of arrogance that comes from being told your whole life that you're brilliant, says something about the nurse playing soldier. Another resident laughs. The sound makes her hand still for exactly 1 second, and then she continues her work. She has survived worse than laughter. The ambulance bay doors slam open at 2,147 hours like a gunshot. The sound reverberates through the entire ground floor, that specific metallic crash that means critical incoming. Trauma alert. The red phone in the ER screams, and every head in the hospital turns toward the bay. Boots on tile. Multiple paramedics running. The smell of diesel fuel and ozone cuts through the antiseptic sting of the hospital. Megan is on the 4th floor when she hears it, but she knows. 12 years in special operations teaches you to read chaos the way other people read newspapers. That crash means something catastrophic just rolled through those doors. She finds herself moving toward the stairwell before her conscious mind has caught up. Her feet know the way. Her body remembers extraction protocols. The trauma team assembles in Bay 1 like a coordinated strike force. For paramedics are running a full resuscitation on a man who looks like he's been through a building collapse. Compound fractures in both legs. Deep laceration across the left side of the torso. Trauma shears have split his clothes away, revealing pale skin and a chest that's barely moving. The paramedic calls out vitals like coordinates, BP 90/60 and dropping. Respiratory distress. Possible tension pneumothorax. Then Dr. Whitfield enters the bay, and the room shifts. He's flanked by other physicians, an attending from orthopedics, 2 surgical residents, the trauma surgeon on call. Their faces move through the same progression: assessment, calculation, conclusion. Megan watches from the doorway, her body still in her scrubs, her mind already performing triage on the injuries. The pattern recognition is automatic. Catastrophic crush injuries. Blast trauma architecture, she'd recognize it anywhere, because she's treated it in forward operating bases under fire while helicopters circled overhead. Dr. Whitfield reads the chart with one hand while observing the patient with clinical detachment. Severe crush injury, he says. Massive internal bleeding. Compound fractures both femurs, crush syndrome confirmed. Renal damage likely. ETA to OR is 4 minutes, a resident says. Cancel it, Dr. Whitfield says. The room goes so quiet you can hear the ventilator wheeze. So. A surgical intern, young and certain he misheard. This patient isn't viable, Dr. Whitfield says. He's not angry. He's certain. Multiple system failure in progress. Even if we get him to the operating room, the damage is unsurvivable. 2 hours maximum, realistically less. We'd be wasting resources on a futile intervention. He walks to the door and picks up the phone mounted on the wall, the kind doctors used to call consults. His voice is measured and professional as he begins dialing. I need the trauma committee. Within 20 minutes, they arrive. One by one, they enter Bay 1. Dr. Matheson from cardiology. Dr. Singh from neurology. Dr. Ramirez from trauma surgery. The chief of internal medicine. The head of orthopedics. A physician from ICU. Another trauma specialist. Another surgical attending. And one more, a consulting physician from the trauma network. 10 physicians. Each one arrives with the confident stride of someone whose opinion has never been questioned in a room full of other doctors. They stand around the bed like judges at an execution. They look at the monitors. They look at the chart. They look at the patient, a man with the kind of muscular build that suggests decades of physical conditioning, now still and broken. One by one, they nod. Inviable, says Dr. Matheson. No point, says Dr. Singh. This is only prolonging suffering, says Dr. Ramirez. Dr. Whitfield watches with the satisfied expression of a man whose authority has been affirmed by 10 other experts. The consensus is absolute. The case is hopeless. The decision is made. Megan stands in the doorway, watching this choreographed surrender, and something inside her goes very still. Not trembling. Not breaking. Still. The 10 physicians file out. They have other patients, other cases where intervention might actually matter. Dr. Whitfield lingers for one moment, and his eyes land on Megan standing in the doorway. His expression doesn't change, but something in his posture shifts. A recognition that she's there. A subtle assertion that this is a room for physicians, not nurses. She meets his gaze with the flatness of someone staring at a wall, and then he turns and leaves. The machines continue their rhythmic beeping. The monitors trace the patient's vital signs, lines that are already beginning to flatten like a landscape after an earthquake. The trauma bay settles into the strange quiet of a room where everyone has already decided on the ending. Megan pulls up a chair. She sits beside the bed and watches the monitors, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. Nobody tells her to leave. Nobody tells her to do anything at all. She is just a nurse in a trauma bay with a dying patient and 10 physicians who have already written the final paragraph. But she sees something they didn't. During grand rounds on the 4th floor, 17 residents stood in perfect formation around a light box displaying imaging. Dr. Whitfield commanded the space like a conductor, his voice precise and practiced. The morning had that particular hospital hum, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the distant beep of monitors, the soft squeak of shoe soles on polished tile. Megan stood against the back wall, clipboard in hand, trying to blend into the antiseptic geometry of the room. Whitfield gestured toward her with the kind of casual cruelty reserved for teaching moments. "This is what we call inappropriate emotional attachment," he announced, his tone suggesting he was naming a disease. "Nurse O'Brien has repeatedly questioned our collective medical judgment regarding the General. 10 physicians, 10, have concurred this case is hopeless, yet she persists in suggesting interventions." The resident scribbled notes like they were transcribing scripture. "She demonstrates poor boundaries, perhaps some hero fantasy about saving a decorated soldier. This is how nurses overstep their lane, how they confuse compassion with competence." Megan's face remained blank. Her pulse didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. There was a particular skill to this kind of public execution, the way you could train your body to remain absolutely still while someone dismantled your professionalism in front of an audience. It was like muscle memory from another life, the kind of composure you learned when silence was survival. She watched Whitfield's eye search her face for a reaction, hunting for something to escalate. Finding nothing, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he turned back to his residence. The lesson here is clear boundaries. Medicine is a science. 10 separate physicians reached the same conclusion. That consensus exists for a reason. It protects patients, and it protects us from the liability of false hope. He smiled, satisfied with his own wisdom. The residents nodded in unison, already internalizing this version of the story. Megan remained motionless until the group filed out, then returned to the ICU without acknowledging anyone. That afternoon, she overheard them at the vending machines. 2 residents, no, not residents. Dr. Marcus Chen and Dr. Robert Hayes. One of the physicians who'd examined the General's scans, the other who'd reviewed his cardiopulmonary status. Both had been among the 10 who'd turned away. "Hey, it's Nurse Rambo," Chen snickered, his voice carrying easily across the break room. His companion laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that bounced off the metal machine. "Maybe she thinks she can perform surgery with a bayonet," Hayes added, and they both erupted into the kind of laughter that felt like dominance, like power. 10 doctors say stop, but the nurse wants to play soldier. They didn't lower their voices. Megan selected her coffee, black, exact change, no eye contact, and walked past them with her shoulders square and her breathing steady. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge them. She simply moved through the space like she had every right to occupy it, and that was the only response that mattered. Behind her, their laughter died out faster than it had started. That evening, Whitfield found her outside the General's ICU room. She was checking the monitor readouts from the hallway, something she'd been doing compulsively every 3 hours, watching his rhythm deteriorate from PVCs into runs of ventricular tachycardia that nobody was treating. The night attending had written comfort care only and left. Nobody was fighting anymore. The consensus was complete. Whitfield's presence arrived before his voice did, a shift in air pressure, the way apex predators change the room when they enter it. His footsteps were measured, controlled, designed to convey authority without rushing. "Security has been instructed," he said quietly, positioning himself between Megan and the General's door. "If you enter that room again, they will escort you out of this hospital in handcuffs. Do you understand, Nurse O'Brien? Or do I need to use smaller words?" The insult was exquisite, the patronizing tone, the implication that she wouldn't comprehend basic English without it being simplified. This was stage 3 of his escalation. Not just dismissal anymore. Strategic action. Policy as a weapon. Muscle. Her eyes met his, and for one moment, she let him see exactly what she was. Cold. Flat. The kind of steady that comes from having already survived the worst. "Understood, Doctor," she said, and her voice had dropped half an octave. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, a battle for dominance played out in silence, then nodded, satisfied. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the confidence of someone who had just won. Megan waited until his silhouette disappeared around the corner. Then she returned to the break room, logged into the charting system, and completed her documentation on 4 other patients with flawless precision. The hospital observer, the investigator with the severe face and the briefcase, had been there all morning, requesting 3 years of her charting history, asking loaded questions about her judgment calls, her medication timings, her notes on difficult patients. Whitfield had been thorough. He'd called her previous hospital, framed questions about boundary issues and emotional instability, built a file that would follow her like a ghost. 20 minutes later, alone in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, Megan pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving. The closet smelled like bleach and cardboard and institutional resignation. She allowed herself 3 breaths, the kind that came from deep in the diaphragm, the kind that used to help before operations, before insertions, before you had to move faster than fear. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something else. Control. Restraint. The terrible quiet power of knowing exactly what you were capable of and choosing not to unleash it. Then she straightened, smoothed her scrubs, fixed her hair, and returned to work. But that wasn't the worst part. On Friday morning, she received her reassignment notice. Pending the investigation, Whitfield's word against her record, his connections against her solitude, she was being moved to post-surgical recovery. Opposite wing. Completely away from ICU. She could no longer see the general's monitors, could no longer chart his deterioration, could no longer even walk past his room without risking termination. The general remained upstairs in his isolation, heart rhythm deteriorating with each passing hour. PVCs becoming more frequent. Runs of ventricular tachycardia that the night attending noted, documented, and ignored. The night shift resident was new, uncertain, deferential to Whitfield's comfort care only directive. Nobody fought. Nobody resisted. 10 doctors had already decided. The consensus was concrete. Megan had moved to post-surgical recovery on Friday afternoon, assigning patients their pain medication, checking surgical sites, monitoring their recovery from anesthesia. Standard work. Good work. Invisible work. She was 2 floors away from the general's room, 4 hallways removed from his monitors, completely blocked by the hospital's own policies from doing anything except watch and wait and feel the particular helplessness of being trapped by rules while someone died. At 0247 on Saturday morning, a text message arrived on her personal phone. Unknown number, but she recognized the sender immediately, the sympathetic lab tech who'd pulled the general's blood work, the one person in this entire hospital who'd shown her something resembling human decency. The message contained exactly 6 words, general coding. Attending called it. No compression started. No code team summoned. Just a physician standing in a room, noting the time, filling out paperwork, moving on to the next patient. Terminal care meant exactly that. They had already decided he was gone. Megan was out of bed before the text finished loading. Her scrubs were already on, she'd stopped undressing fully, just removing her shoes and keeping everything within arm's reach. Muscle memory. Preparation. The kind of habit you developed when you'd spent 14 years waiting for the exact moment everything would change in the space of 3 seconds. She moved through the corridor at a pace that wasn't quite a run but covered distance like water finding its level. The night shift staff knew better than to question her. Her badge cleared every door. Her presence commanded the kind of authority that didn't require explanation. By the time she reached the ICU on the 4th floor, her pulse had normalized. Her hands were steady. Her mind had already begun to calculate what came next, what she could do, what the rules said she couldn't. The monitor outside the general's room showed what she already knew. Asystole. A flat line that stretched across the screen like punctuation marking the end of a sentence someone else had written. The hallway outside ICU 7 smelled like copper and antiseptic, the overhead fluorescents casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made skin look like death already. Megan had been assigned to trauma recovery on the opposite wing, a deliberate move, a boundary enforced in writing, but she had sight lines. The nursing station had a corner angle that let her see directly into General Hayward's room if she positioned herself just right while charting. Vitals visible on the monitor mounted above his bed. Numbers that told stories. She told herself she was just checking labs, just following protocol, just being thorough like any other nurse. The lie was polished smooth from repetition. At 0247, the monitor showed sinus rhythm with a drift. Concerning but stable. She documented it. At 0258, the rhythm had degraded into something more erratic. At 0301, she was 3 rooms down from her assigned patients when she saw the pattern flatten at the edges. The QRS complex losing definition. Her chest went tight, not fear, not emotional attachment. She would never permit herself that vulnerability, but recognition. The recognition of someone watching a timeline collapse. She should have walked away. Should have charted her last rounds and clocked out at 0630 like every other Saturday morning. Should have honored the boundary that Dr. Whitfield had drawn with the precision of a territorial threat. The monitor flatlined at 0304. She didn't move. She documented 2 more vitals on her current patient, mechanical habit, the kind of anchoring action that kept her from breaking stride. Then she moved. Not a sprint, not yet. Just a nurse checking on something across her unit, crossing between the halogen lights that hummed like cicadas trapped in glass. The attending physician stood beside the general's bed with his hands in his pockets like he was waiting for an elevator. Dr. Marcus Sterling, resident on rotation, the kind of competent who followed protocol to the letter and never asked questions that might complicate his trajectory. The flat line continued across the monitor. A sustained, unambiguous absence. The kind that was supposed to mean finality. Time of death, 0304, he was saying into a digital recorder, his voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone reading instructions aloud. Continuous asystole for 2 minutes with no response to initial assessment. No intervention initiated given the 10-physician consensus on non-viability and the family's DNR status. Except the family had never signed a DNR. That detail sat in the chart like an unfiled form, a technicality that no one was asking about because asking would require caring about answers. Megan's jaw clenched, just perceptibly, a muscle contraction that involved zero emotion, and she moved from walk to sprint. The motion was immediate and total, years of extraction protocol written into muscle memory. She hit the ICU room at a velocity that made the door slam against the wall with a sound like a gunshot. The attending physician stumbled backward, the recorder falling from his hand. Megan shoved past him, actual physical contact, dismissal in motion, and her hand slammed down on the code blue button. The alarm shrieked. The kind of sound that made the building sit up and take notice. Equipment mobilized behind her, feet moving in the hallway, someone calling overhead. Her focus narrowed to the space between ribs and the absence of heartbeat beneath them. She ripped open the general's gown and placed her hands on his sternum to begin compressions. The chest wouldn't depress correctly. Fluid around the heart. Tamponade. Pericardial pressure preventing ventricular filling, the kind of mechanical problem that basic CPR couldn't solve. She needed internal access. Direct hands into the chest cavity. The kind of procedure that wasn't supposed to happen in hospital ICUs with proper equipment and attending physicians, it was supposed to happen in helicopters over Baghdad with nothing but adrenaline and necessity. Nurse, step back, he's gone, the attending sputtered, his voice climbing toward something between shock and indignation. His hand reached toward her shoulder. She didn't acknowledge him. Her hands were already moving toward the thoracotomy kit on the crash cart that had arrived and positioned itself, muscle memory responding to trauma protocol. She found the surgical blade. The anatomy was memory itself, second and third intercostal space, left anterolateral approach. Her hands moved the way they had moved 1,000 times in different contexts, different hemispheres, different lives. The sternum cracked under pressure, a distinct sound, singular and definitive, like tree bark splintering under weight. She spread the ribs with an instrument that looked like something between pliers and a question. The general's chest cavity opened like a door to somewhere else, and everything inside was blood and necessity. Her hands disappeared into the general's chest. She found his heart, smaller than people imagined, dense with failure, textured with muscle. Her fingers began squeezing in a rhythm that wasn't CPR standard. This was extraction rhythm. 1 squeeze per second. Rotating pressure. Thumb supporting the posterior wall to prevent wall rupture. The kind of technique that kept blood moving when there was no time for the proper machinery, when the body was a mechanism and the mind was an engineer with no options. She'd done this 12 times. 11 of those times, the patient lived long enough to reach somewhere with a real surgical team. Blood covered her hands. It was warm. It was information. Pain was data and blood was evidence of flow. The attending physician backed away from the edge of the room, his face the color of old institutional paint. Other night staff froze in the doorway, a respiratory tech, a nursing assistant, someone Megan didn't register. Her visual field had narrowed to nothing but the heart beneath her hands and the monitor to her left. The heart twitched. Once. The monitor blipped. Not a full beat yet, just an electrical acknowledgement that the organ remembered how to respond. Megan maintained compressions. The rhythm came slowly, like someone waking. 1 beat. A pause. 2 beats. The monitor began showing the fragmented pattern of a heart remembering its purpose. She kept squeezing, the angle precise, the pressure exactly sufficient. 90 seconds. 120. Her shoulders had always been strong, from training, from decades of holding weight that wasn't supposed to be held by human bodies. The general's heart beat once per second now, a rhythm that resembled life, and she slowly withdrew her hands and began to close the incision with the swift precision of someone who had trained for this specific moment across 2 decades of silence. The heart continued without her. The monitor showed rhythm. The general gasped, an involuntary reflex, the body remembering autonomy, the lungs filling with air that meant survival instead of cessation. Megan stepped back from the bed. Her hands were crimson to the wrists. Her face showed nothing. Absolute focus, absolute composure, the kind of exterior that belonged to someone who had done this before and would do it again without hesitation or explanation. Security arrived at 0320, with Drive Whitfield behind them, pulled from home at an hour that made his appearance look like emergency and urgency combined. His face went through several stages, shock, then comprehension, then something darker. The attending physician was explaining what had happened, words tumbling over each other like stones down a hill. Megan was already moving toward the sink to wash the blood away. She didn't acknowledge Whitfield. She didn't make eye contact. She was just a nurse who had stepped out of bounds. She was just following the muscle memory of someone who had done something she wasn't supposed to do in a place where protocol mattered more than outcomes. Dr. Whitfield's jaw tightened. His hands formed fists. But that wasn't the worst part for him. The worst part was that the general was still breathing. The worst part was that the heart under those cracked ribs was still beating. And the worst part was that 10 physicians had stood in that hospital 3 days earlier and declared this outcome impossible. Dr. Whitfield's voice could strip paint. Get her out of this room. Now. Security hesitated at the ICU threshold, uncertainty flickering across their faces. The general was alive, stable, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Megan's hands were still inside that cavity, completing the final sutures with the methodical precision of someone who had closed wounds in sandstorms and darkness. She didn't acknowledge Whitfield's command. She tied the last knot. Pulled her gloves off with a snap that sounded like a small defeat. Step back. Blood soaked her scrubs like a watermark, rust-colored and damning. You just ended your career, Whitfield hissed, his voice dropping into the register of absolute certainty. I want her credentials pulled immediately. Today. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Said nothing. Walked past him toward the door, her movement carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The kind of calm that made Whitfield's face darken with something between rage and fear, the recognition that he had miscalculated, that the woman he dismissed as a boundary-crossing nurse had just made him look like a fool in front of 6 witnesses. By 0600 Saturday morning, he was making calls. For board members, each woken at home before dawn, each receiving Whitfield's version first. His voice over the phone was different than his voice in the hospital, smoother, more practiced, the tone of someone accustomed to being believed. He didn't describe what had happened. He contextualized it. A nurse. Insubordinate. Emotionally unstable. Performed procedures outside her scope. Ignored direct physician orders. Endangered a patient through reckless intervention. He had documentation. He was concerned about her fitness for practice. He was calling because he felt obligated to inform the board immediately. Protocol, you understand, patient safety. The board members listened. 3 of them had known Whitfield for 15 years. One owed him a favor from a research grant 3 years prior. They didn't ask questions. They listened and they believed, because that's what power sounds like, calm certainty delivered before sunrise. By mid-morning, Whitfield contacted Megan's previous hospital in Seattle. He spoke to the nursing director, Dr. Patricia Hearn, a woman he'd met at a conference in 2019. His questions were surgical. "I'm just gathering some context on a staff member we're evaluating," he said. "Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien worked in your emergency department for 4 years. Can you speak to her stability under pressure? Any concerns about her judgment? Any incidents we should know about?" The way he phrased it, any concerns, any incidents, created the impression that concerns already existed, that he was simply confirming what others had found. Dr. Hearn, uncomfortable being put in this position, mentioned a single incident from 2018 when Megan had stayed 14 hours past her shift to monitor a critical patient, had become emotionally invested in the outcome. Whitfield thanked her and said that was exactly the kind of pattern he was concerned about. Pattern. As if one incident had become many. The narrative was forming. Unstable. Boundary crossing. Emotionally compromised. Reckless. By noon Saturday, hospital administration had activated a formal investigation. A hospital investigator named David Sorensen, thin-lipped and meticulous, began the work of reviewing 3 years of Megan's charting decisions. Every entry she'd made. Every patient interaction documented. Every medication she'd administered, every procedure she'd assisted on, every shift note. He wasn't looking for violations, he was looking for narrative, for a pattern that could be constructed retroactively into something resembling a case. Whitfield had given him direction. Focus on her relationship to the trauma patient. Look for documentation that suggests she was acting outside her scope. He found what he was looking for because he was looking for it. A note from Tuesday, patient showing slight improvement in neurological response. Continued close monitoring. Sorensen flagged it. Implies independent clinical judgment beyond nursing scope. Another from Wednesday, advocated for continued aggressive intervention despite physician recommendation for comfort care. Flagged. Directly contradicted attending physician orders. Nothing egregious. Nothing criminal. But flagged and collected, the entries began to form a tapestry of insubordination. By Saturday afternoon, Sorensen had the outline of his report, a nurse who had consistently advocated for one patient, who had established an inappropriate attachment, who had ignored physician directives, who had performed an emergency procedure without authorization that, regardless of outcome, violated hospital protocol and state nursing regulations. The building was methodical. Institutional. Unstoppable. At noon Saturday, security delivered her suspension notice to the break room. Other nurses watched, not making eye contact, but watching. The security officer, Marcus Webb, looked uncomfortable. He'd worked with Megan for 2 years. He knew what she'd done was impossible and brave. But he had his orders. "Ms. O'Brien, you're to report to HR immediately. This is a notice of immediate suspension pending investigation." The letter was printed on hospital letterhead, official and cold. The words felt like betrayal because they were betrayal, institutional rejection moving at the speed of bureaucracy. By evening, hospital administration revoked her credentials entirely. The termination letter cited policy violations, performing procedures outside scope of practice, ignoring physician orders, compromising patient dignity. Each violation was supported by Sorensen's curated documentation. Whitfield's connections had already ensured that this wasn't just termination, it was institutional erasure. He'd contacted the Texas Board of Nursing with preliminary concerns. He'd flagged her file in 3 state systems. The violations would follow her. Any hospital that called her references would hear questions phrased the way Whitfield had phrased them, any concerns, any incidents. The infrastructure of professional destruction was complete. At 18:45 Saturday evening, during shift change, Megan returned to the hospital laundry. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, indifferent and pale. She opened her locker one final time. Removed her badge. Held it for a moment, the photograph from 3 years ago, her face neutral, her name printed in bold, M. O'Brien, RN. 3 years of shift changes, of patients saved, of midnight codes and impossible recoveries, reduced to an employee ID number. She gathered her scrubs, the pale blue ones, bloodstained from the general's chest, the evidence of something that had worked despite all institutional opposition. She carried them to the soiled linen bin. Her hands folded the fabric one final time, muscle memory making the motions precise even as the institutional framework crumbled around her. The scrubs felt thin in her hands. Fragile. Temporary. Other nurses moved through the laundry room, eyes averted. Nobody spoke to her. The silence was the absence of alliance, the sound of people protecting themselves by pretending they didn't see her. She placed her badge on the supervisor's desk, Rosalind Martinez, who'd always been kind, who now couldn't meet her gaze. "I'm sorry," Rosalind whispered. Megan nodded. There was nothing to say. The institutional rejection was complete and total. At 1900 Saturday evening, she walked out through the employee entrance, carrying a small box of personal items. 3 years erased. The box contained a stethoscope, a pen from a pharmaceutical company, a thank you card from a patient's family dated 18 months prior. Minimal. Portable. All that remained of 3 years inside an institution that had decided she was disposable. Outside, she sat in her car for 11 minutes. Hands on the steering wheel. Staring at nothing. The parking lot lights cast everything in sodium vapor orange, the color of temporary things. Her phone sat dark on the passenger seat. No messages. No calls. The silence of professional isolation is its own kind of violence, not dramatic, not sudden, but complete. Total. She was no longer part of the network. She was outside now. Beyond the boundary. Then she drove home. The city blurred past, streetlights and traffic signals and the ordinary machinery of Saturday night, all of it indifferent to her erasure. By Sunday afternoon, 3 days after the code, something would shift in the architecture of her situation. But in this moment, driving through San Antonio with a box of belongings and a revoked credential, she knew only that she had saved a man's life and paid every institutional price for it. The worst part wasn't the firing. The worst part wasn't the humiliation or the coordinated destruction of her professional reputation. The worst part was knowing she'd do it again. The worst part was understanding that some choices don't offer the luxury of regret. 3 days later, a transferred patient arrived on the orthopedic ward, a man whose hands were scarred beyond recognition, whose left eye socket bore the permanent mark of shrapnel, who'd been captured in Fallujah in 2004 and finally extradited after 20 years in detention. He was being processed for discharge when he saw Megan in the corridor outside ICU, escorting a small cardboard box containing the last 3 years of her life. She wore street clothes now. No badge. No scrubs. Just a woman moving through the hospital like a ghost of someone who used to belong there. The patient went rigid. His breath caught. And in Arabic, barely audible, he whispered the word that had terrified enemy combatants across 3 provinces, Valkyrie. The security guard stationed at the corridor entrance, a veteran of Operation Enduring Freedom, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, froze mid-step. His face drained of color. He'd been there. He'd seen her work in field hospitals under fire. He'd heard the stories, the call signs, the legends that got passed through combat zones like scripture. He turned toward Megan, then back toward the patient, then toward the growing crowd of staff who'd caught the moment like electricity spreads through water. "Wait," the security guard said, his voice rising. Valkyrie was a Master Chief Petty Officer. Special Operations. The name hung in the corridor air like a defibrillator shock. Nobody moved. The transferred patient began to cry. He was calling her name in English now, Master Chief, and staff members were pulling out their phones, were whispering, were staring at the woman in jeans and a grey jacket holding a box of belongings as if she were a photograph coming into focus. General Hayward woke at that moment to the commotion outside his room. His consciousness had been climbing for 2 days, pain, then morphine, then the ability to open his eyes, then the understanding that he was breathing on his own, that his heart was still beating, that something impossible had occurred and he was still alive to comprehend it. He demanded his file. His hands, still shaking from intensive care, trembled as he read the medical record, the notation in the chart, emergency open thoracotomy performed 030 for hours by nursing staff. Direct cardiac massage. Patient resuscitated. He scrolled through the documents. He found her service record. They'd kept it sealed for 20 years, but the declassification order had come through 2 days ago when the insurgents' trial made everything public anyway. He read the citations aloud, his voice gathering strength with each word. Bronze Star with Valor. Staff members outside his room went motionless. Silver Star. The corridor had gone completely quiet. Another Silver Star. One nurse covered her mouth. A third Silver Star. And a fourth Silver Star. His voice dropped to something that sounded like prayer, Navy Cross. Nobody spoke. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator in the next bed hissed its mechanical breath. The fluorescent lights above hummed their endless electronic song. Then the general's voice cracked completely. "This Master Chief," he said, reading from the declassified file, "shielded me from shrapnel during a mortar strike in Baghdad in 2003. She was 19 years old. I was 8. She lost her right kidney taking rounds meant for a child she didn't know. She pulled me out of rubble. She kept me breathing until the Black Hawk arrived. And 10 doctors told her to let me die 3 days ago. 10 physicians, in a unified professional opinion, agreed that I was non-viable. And she saved me anyway." The silence lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then the doors burst open from the administrative corridor. A Pentagon liaison walked through, a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s carrying a leather briefcase. Behind her came 2 Defense Department officials in dark suits, their faces set like concrete. They moved with the precision of people whose authority predated the hospital's existence. Dr. Whitfield appeared at the nurse's station, his face already pale, already sensing that something was catastrophically wrong. He tried to speak. "This is irrelevant to any patient outcome assessment." The physician team made a sound clinical judgment. "Dr. Whitfield," the senior official asked. His voice was quiet. "That's what made it lethal. You are the physician who obstructed Master Chief O'Brien's medical intervention." 10 doctors, Whitfield started. "You threatened her with arrest for attempting to save a 4-star general's life," the official continued. "You stripped the credentials of a decorated Master Chief Petty Officer for performing direct cardiac massage, a procedure she is uniquely qualified for given her combat medical experience. You are aware that obstructing a classified military operator in performance of duties violates Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 2387. Whitfield's face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. "I didn't know she never disclosed." "She was under orders not to disclose," the official said coldly. "Classified Operation Burial. She legally could not tell you. You had a duty to accept her clinical judgment. You had a duty to step back. Instead, you weaponized hospital policy to prevent a Master Chief Petty Officer from saving a 4-star general's life." The crowd had grown. Someone was filming on their phone. Someone else was calling local news. Within 12 minutes, the first news van pulled into the parking lot. The officials turned to the hospital board chair, who'd arrived looking like a man watching his career evaporate in real time. Effective immediately, the official announced, loud enough for the cameras now rolling, loud enough for the 200 staff and visitors in the hospital corridor to hear. Dr. Thomas Whitfield is terminated for obstruction of a federal operator and reckless endangerment of a 4-star general. Whitfield tried to speak. His jaw worked. Nothing came out. The hospital board chair didn't even let him attempt again. Security, please escort Dr. Whitfield from the premises. 8 minutes. His badge was gone. His access was stripped. His office was sealed. He walked out through the same glass doors that Meghan had used 3 days earlier, but now with cameras following, his face bright red, his hands shaking so badly he could barely push the door open. One camera caught him outside the building, standing in the rain, looking down at his empty hands as if he couldn't remember what they were supposed to be holding. The footage went viral within an hour. 6 months later, former colleagues reported seeing Dr. Thomas Whitfield at San Antonio Community College, teaching CPR certification courses for $18 per hour. His hands trembled while demonstrating compressions on a plastic dummy. Students didn't know who he was. His medical license was suspended pending full review. 3 other cases emerged where he'd reported nurses for overstepping, only to have those interventions examined and found to be competent emergency medicine, just delivered by practitioners without his credentials and without his blessing. The board investigation lasted for months. His network had dissolved the moment the federal investigation touched it. Board members he'd cultivated for years distanced themselves overnight. His wife filed for divorce 2 months after his firing. He taught CPR at a community college now, and the students who paid $32 for weekend certification courses had no idea that the trembling hands demonstrating chest compressions belonged to a man who'd once held the authority to destroy careers. Muscle memory took over sometimes. He'd start to issue orders to students and catch himself, correcting course, speaking like someone who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Meghan stood in General Hayward's recovery room at Walter Reed Medical Center, where he'd completed his rehabilitation. He was in dress uniform for his reinstatement ceremony, the kind of event that gets covered by military news networks, where officers with stars on their shoulders shake hands with other officers with stars on their shoulders, and the invisible work of survival gets compressed into a 72-hour media cycle. Beneath his bed sat a glass display case containing a pair of worn combat boots, child-sized, caked with dry dust from Baghdad 2003. The plaque read, "Carried by General Marcus Hayward, April 2003, Baghdad." Worn the day Master Chief Meghan O'Brien saved his life the first time. She wore her dress blues. Master Chief insignia gleamed on her collar. The Navy Cross hung on her chest, the ribbon color unmistakable to anyone with military knowledge, a cross of valor that sits third in the naval hierarchy of heroism, just below the Medal of Honor itself. The order burying her identity had been lifted. The operation declassified. Her service record now existed in the public domain, no longer buried in black redacted folders. She'd been offered a position training combat medics at Fort Sam Houston. 3 universities had requested her for speaking engagements. The trauma surgery department at Johns Hopkins wanted to recruit her for their fellowship program. The general extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was steady now, the tremor gone, the healing complete, the miracle of muscle and cardiac tissue regenerating into function. "You know," he said quietly, 10 doctors told me I was dead. But you knew better." Meghan allowed herself the smallest smile, barely a shifting of her jaw. "I've never been good at following orders, sir." He laughed. The sound came out free, unencumbered, the laugh of a man who'd expected to die and instead got to live. Outside his room, reporters waited for a statement. The general would tell them what they wanted to hear. "Master Chief O'Brien taught me that true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." But Meghan slipped out through the side entrance, away from cameras, away from the cycle of recognition and media, back toward the work that didn't require an audience. Back toward training the next generation of medics. Back toward the kind of quiet that comes from people who've already proven everything they need to prove. The boots remained in their glass case at Walter Reed, protected under climate control, a monument to a debt that could never be repaid, only honored. Some bonds transcend time. Some heroism exists beyond the reach of institutional power or professional jealousy or the fragile authority of men who'd never heard explosions and lived. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. If you made it this far, you understand now why those 10 doctors failed. Why one nurse succeeded. Why some people walk through fire so quietly that the people around them don't even realize the smoke is there. Subscribe for more stories of the ones nobody saw coming. Like this video if you would have walked away. And comment, would you have saved him, or would you have followed orders? What would you have done?